Have you ever heard stories of ancient prophecies, whispered in hushed tones, about a child destined for greatness, even before he drew his first breath? It's almost as if the universe itself was holding its breath on that fateful day in Bela, 356 BCE, when Philip II of Macedon, a shrewd and ambitious king, welcomed his son Alexander. This wasn't just any birth. It was an event imbued with such portent that people today still wonder about the celestial alignments, the strange omens that supposedly accompanied his arrival. Some even say a temple to Artemis burned down that very night, as if the goddess herself was making way for this new earthly force. His mother, Olympias, a fiery and fiercely protective woman from Epirus, believed Alexander's destiny was tied to the gods, perhaps even that Zeus himself was his true father. A claim that surely raised a few eyebrows around the palace, but undeniably fueled her son's sense of divine right. From the moment he was a tiny bundle, he was not merely a prince. He was a project, designed by Philip to be the ultimate heir, a living embodiment of Macedonian power and ambition. His early years were spent in the royal court, a place teeming with political intrigue, military strategizing, and the constant hum of a kingdom expanding its influence. He learned to ride almost before he could properly walk, galloping across the rugged Macedonian landscape, his small hands gripping the reins with an intensity that hinted at the grip he would one day have on vast empires. His education, too, was meticulously crafted, not just in the art of war, but in rhetoric, philosophy, and the epic tales of Achilles, his supposed ancestor, whose heroic deeds no doubt filled the young prince's imagination. He devoured these stories, seeing himself in the valiant warriors and clever strategists, dreaming of his own legends. Historians still argue whether Philip truly foresaw the sheer scale of Alexander's future conquests, or simply intended for him to secure Macedon's regional dominance. But one thing is clear: Alexander's early life was a crucible, forging the character of a man who would redefine the known world. He learned discipline from his tutors, cunning from observing his father's court, and a fierce independence from a mother who instilled in him a belief in his own unique destiny. It's almost comical to imagine the tutors trying to rein in this whirlwind of a child, a miniature general in the making, already pushing boundaries, questioning norms, and probably riding circles around them with a mischievous glint in his eye. This was no pampered prince. He was a sharp, inquisitive, and physically formidable boy, constantly testing his limits, ready to burst forth from the confines of the palace and etch his name into the annals of history, a name that would echo far beyond the small, mountainous kingdom of Macedon. Can you imagine what it must have been like, having the greatest mind of your age, a philosopher whose ideas would shape Western thought for millennia, as your personal tutor? It almost sounds like the setup for a very intense reality show, doesn't it? Well, that was precisely the reality for young Alexander when, at the tender age of 13, his father Philip shrewdly brought in Aristotle to guide his intellectual development. This wasn't some run-of-the-mill private tutor. This was the Aristotle, a man whose teachings on logic, ethics, politics, and the natural world were revolutionary, a towering intellect who had already studied under Plato himself. Philip understood that true power wasn't just about military might. It was also about intellectual sophistication, and he wanted his son to be not only a formidable warrior, but a wise and enlightened ruler. For 3 pivotal years, from 343 to 340 BCE, Alexander was immersed in a rigorous curriculum at the school of Mieza, a sort of ancient elite boarding school nestled in the Macedonian countryside. Here, surrounded by other young nobles, his companions in learning, and later in conquest, Alexander delved deep into a vast array of subjects. Aristotle didn't just lecture, he fostered a spirit of inquiry, encouraging Alexander to observe, to question, to think critically about the world around him. They explored medicine, mathematics, and the natural sciences, dissecting animals and plants, examining the stars, and debating the fundamental principles of existence. It's amusing to picture the young prince, perhaps a bit restless at times, being forced to sit still and ponder the intricacies of syllogisms when all he really wanted to do was practice his javelin throws. Yet, Aristotle's influence was profound, particularly in shaping Alexander's understanding of strategy and governance. He instilled in Alexander a deep appreciation for Greek culture, literature, and philosophy, especially the works of Homer. The Iliad, in particular, became Alexander's constant companion, a copy of which he reportedly kept under his pillow, inspiring his ideals of heroism, glory, and leadership. He saw himself as a new Achilles, destined for epic deeds. Historians still argue whether Aristotle actively encouraged Alexander's imperial ambitions, or merely provided him with the intellectual tools to pursue them. Did he whisper grand visions of a Hellenized world into the young prince's ear, or did he simply teach him how to dissect an argument as precisely as he might later dissect an enemy's battle formation? Regardless, Aristotle's systematic approach to knowledge, his emphasis on observation and logical reasoning, profoundly influenced Alexander's strategic thinking and his later efforts to organize and administer his vast empire. The philosopher taught him the value of understanding diverse cultures and the importance of spreading Greek ideas, an intellectual seed that would blossom into the Hellenistic age. This wasn't just book learning. It was the forging of a worldview, equipping Alexander not just with facts, but with a framework for understanding and ultimately conquering the world. You know, it's one thing to read about battles in dusty old history books, but it's quite another to be right there, on the muddy ground, watching a teenage prince prove he's got the grit of a seasoned commander. That's exactly what Alexander did during his early military career, long before he ever dreamt of conquering Persia. His father, Philip, was a military genius in his own right, constantly expanding Macedonian power, and he wasn't about to let his son sit around twiddling his thumbs. From a surprisingly young age, Alexander wasn't just observing from the sidelines. He was actively participating in campaigns, getting his hands dirty, and learning the brutal realities of warfare firsthand. His first taste of real combat came at the tender age of 16, when Philip left him in charge of Macedon while he was off campaigning. Imagine being a teenager, suddenly responsible for an entire kingdom, with the very real threat of barbarian tribes sniffing around your borders. Alexander, however, didn't just hold the fort. He immediately showed his proactive spirit. He led a campaign against the Mighty, a Thracian tribe that had been causing trouble, and not only defeated them, but established a new Macedonian colony, which he, rather modestly, named Alexandropolis. It was a clear sign that this wasn't going to be a boy content with just maintaining the status quo. But the real game changer came in 338 BCE at the Battle of Chaeronea. This was a monumental clash where Philip's Macedonian forces faced a formidable alliance of Greek city-states, including Athens and Thebes, at the peak of their military prowess. It was essentially the final showdown for Greek supremacy, and Alexander, now 18, was given command of the elite companion cavalry on the left flank. Can you even fathom the pressure? Leading arguably the most crucial charge in perhaps the most important battle of his father's reign, with the fate of Greece hanging in the balance. It's almost comical to think of the Greek generals probably scoffing at the thought of a boy king leading such a vital contingent. Yet Alexander delivered a decisive blow, famously shattering the sacred band of Thebes, an elite unit previously thought invincible, a unit whose members fought and died together, famously intertwined even in death. Historians still argue whether Alexander's charge was a pre-planned tactical maneuver or a brilliant opportunistic improvisation, but its impact was undeniable. His cavalry broke through the enemy lines, creating a gap that Philip's phalanx exploited, sealing a resounding Macedonian victory and ending Greek independence. It was a moment that solidified Alexander's reputation, not just as a prince, but as a legitimate and formidable military leader in his own right, earning him the admiration and respect of his father and the Macedonian army. He proved he wasn't just Philip's son. He was Alexander, a force to be reckoned with on the battlefield, already displaying the tactical brilliance and fearless charge that would define his future conquests. Have you ever heard those whispers, the ones that follow powerful people, hinting at dark ambitions and even darker deeds lurking in the shadows? It's a tale as old as time, really, the sudden fall of a king and the swift rise of his heir. And that's exactly what happened in 336 BCE, when Philip II of Macedon, the architect of Macedonian supremacy, was assassinated. Imagine the shockwaves that rippled through the ancient world. It was like a sudden, violent earthquake, shifting the very foundations of power. Philip, remember him, the brilliant general who had united Greece under his sway, was at a grand celebration, the wedding of his daughter Cleopatra to Alexander I of Epirus, Alexander the Great's uncle. The air was thick with festivity, pomp, and probably more than a little political maneuvering, as these events always were. And then tragedy struck. He was stabbed by Pausanias, one of his own bodyguards, right there in front of everyone. The scene must have been absolute chaos, a sudden plunge from joyous celebration into horrified disbelief. The motives behind Pausanias' act remain one of history's most enduring mysteries, a juicy conspiracy theory that still gets historians riled up. Was it a personal vendetta, as some accounts suggest, a bodyguard seeking revenge for a personal slight? Or was it something far more insidious, a plot orchestrated by powerful figures, perhaps even from within Philip's own court? Some theories, the really juicy ones, even point fingers at Olympias, Alexander's mother, known for her fierce devotion to her son and her deep resentment of Philip's other wives and children. Others whisper about Persian involvement, eager to destabilize their formidable Western rival. Historians still argue whether Alexander himself had any foreknowledge or played any role in his father's death. It's a thorny question, debated for centuries, with no definitive answer, leaving it perpetually shrouded in intriguing ambiguity. But regardless of who was behind it, the immediate consequence was undeniable. The throne was vacant, and a power vacuum, however brief, is always dangerous. Alexander, at the tender age of 20, was immediately proclaimed king by the army, a testament to his already proven military prowess and his strong ties to the Macedonian fighting force. It was a swift, almost instantaneous transition, crucial in preventing any prolonged struggle for succession. He had to act decisively, and he did, demonstrating a political acumen far beyond his years. The weight of an entire kingdom, indeed, an entire recently conquered Hellenic world, now rested on his young shoulders, a moment that simultaneously thrust him into absolute power and into the greatest challenge of his life. So with the sudden, almost cinematic, death of his father, the weight of the world, or at least the Macedonian world, fell squarely onto Alexander's 20-year-old shoulders. It's one thing to inherit a kingdom. It's another entirely to secure it, especially when that kingdom is a patchwork of newly conquered territories and a royal court riddled with potential rivals and restless nobles. Alexander knew with absolute certainty that any hesitation, any perceived weakness would invite immediate challenges. This wasn't just about putting on the crown. It was about demonstrating unequivocally that he was the man in charge, the new lion of Macedon. His first actions were swift, ruthless, and absolutely decisive, a masterclass in consolidating power. He didn't waste a single moment. All potential rivals to the throne, any relatives who might dare to challenge his legitimacy, and there were quite a few, including his half-brother and other members of the royal family, were dealt with. And by dealt with, we're talking about eliminating them, sometimes with chilling efficiency. It's brutal, yes, but in the cutthroat politics of ancient Macedon, it was often the only way to send an unmistakable message. I am the king, and my rule is absolute. This wasn't just cold-blooded ambition. It was a pragmatic necessity to ensure stability and to project an image of unshakable authority. Next, he turned his attention to the Greek city-states, those notoriously independent polities that Philip had only recently brought under Macedonian control. They saw Philip's death as an opportunity, a chance to shake off the Macedonian yoke and regain their autonomy. Thebes, always a hotbed of resistance, led the charge, openly revolting and expelling the Macedonian garrison. Athens, ever the rival, also began to stir. It was a true test of Alexander's nascent kingship. Did he send a strongly worded letter? No. Did he negotiate? Not really. He marched, and he marched with incredible speed, covering vast distances in a matter of days, completely catching the rebellious Greeks off guard. This rapid response, a hallmark of his future campaigns, demonstrated his military genius and his unwavering resolve. When he arrived at Thebes, instead of a drawn-out siege, he attacked with overwhelming force. The ensuing destruction was horrific, a brutal lesson for any other city thinking of rebellion. The city was razed to the ground, its population enslaved, except for the temples and the house of the poet Pindar, a curious act of selective preservation. Historians still argue whether the destruction of Thebes was an act of calculated terror to send a message or an uncontrollable outburst of rage, but its impact was profound. The message was clear. Resistance to Alexander meant annihilation. The other Greek city-states, witnessing the terrifying fate of Thebes, immediately backed down, hastily reaffirming their allegiance to Macedon and acknowledging Alexander as their new hegemon. Within months of his father's death, Alexander had not only secured his throne, but had also reasserted complete control over the restive Greek world, setting the stage for the audacious campaigns he was about to launch. He had proven, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that he was truly Philip's son. And perhaps something even more. All right, imagine this. You've just inherited a powerful kingdom, suppressed a few pesky rebellions, and secured your borders. What's the logical next step for most rulers? Settle in, enjoy the spoils, maybe build a nice new palace. But for Alexander, that wasn't even on the menu. His thoughts were already miles, no, thousands of miles, away across the Aegean Sea, fixed firmly on the Persian Empire. This wasn't just some whimsical ambition. It was a long-standing Macedonian dream, fueled by generations of grievances and a genuine desire to avenge the Persian invasions of Greece from over a century ago. Philip, his father, had already laid the groundwork, even sending an advance force into Asia Minor. But Alexander, ever the one to take things to the next level, envisioned something far grander than mere revenge or limited territorial gain. He dreamt of a unified Hellenic world, leading a crusade against the colossal Achaemenid Empire, a superpower that dwarfed Macedon in size, wealth, and perceived might. The Persian Empire was a truly massive entity, stretching from Egypt to India, controlling vast resources and boasting an army that at least on paper seemed limitless. It was ruled by Darius III, a king who, while not entirely inept, was certainly about to underestimate the fiery young Macedonian at his peril. The sheer audacity of Alexander's plan is almost comical. A tiny kingdom deciding to take on the equivalent of the ancient world's global superpower. It was a gamble of epic proportions, a true David and Goliath scenario, but Alexander was convinced of his destiny. In the spring of 334 BCE, after meticulous preparation and ensuring his own kingdom was stable, Alexander gathered his forces. We're talking about roughly 48,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, a formidable army by Greek standards, but still a fraction of what Persia could theoretically field. He appointed Antipater, a seasoned general, as regent of Macedon, ensuring stability at home. Then, with a dramatic flourish, he crossed the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia, reportedly throwing his spear into Asian soil, symbolically claiming the continent for himself. It was a powerful, almost theatrical gesture, signaling his intent to conquer, not just to raid. This wasn't just a military campaign, it was presented as a pan-Hellenic crusade, a war to liberate the Greek cities of Asia Minor from Persian rule and to punish Persia for its past aggressions. Historians still argue whether Alexander genuinely believed in this pan-Hellenic ideal, or if it was merely clever propaganda to rally the diverse Greek states behind his banner. Regardless of his true motivations, one thing was clear: the die was cast. Alexander was now on Persian soil, a tiny spark ready to ignite a massive conflagration that would reshape the entire ancient world. The stage was set for a series of epic confrontations, and the first major test of Alexander's leadership and military genius was just around the corner, waiting for him on the banks of a river. Imagine standing on the bank of a river, staring across at an enemy army that outnumbers you, knowing that the very first engagement of your grand campaign could spell triumph or total disaster. That was the scene for Alexander in May of 334 BCE at the Battle of the Granicus River. It was his baptism by fire on Asian soil, the initial confrontation between his disciplined Macedonian forces and the provincial Persian satraps who governed Asia Minor. The Persians, confident in their numbers and their defensive position along the high, steep banks of the river, had assembled a formidable force. They had their cavalry, renowned for its skill, positioned strategically at the front, ready to meet any crossing attempt, with their Greek mercenary infantry, a curious but common feature of ancient warfare, stationed behind them. It's almost comical to think they believed a river would stop Alexander. He wasn't exactly known for his patience or his aversion to a challenge. Their plan was straightforward: pin down the Macedonians as they struggled across the river, then cut them to pieces. But Alexander, ever the audacious tactician, had other ideas. Instead of waiting or finding an easier crossing point, he decided on a direct, frontal assault, a move that stunned both his own generals and the enemy. He led the charge himself, riding Bucephalus, his legendary warhorse, right into the teeth of the Persian defenses. This wasn't just a tactical decision, it was a psychological one, a powerful display of personal courage that electrified his troops and probably sent shivers down the spines of the Persians. The initial crossing was brutal. The Macedonian phalanx, struggling in the strong current and slippery banks, came under a hail of arrows and javelins. It was a messy, desperate fight in the water as men grappled with their footing and their enemies simultaneously. Alexander, at the head of his companion cavalry, plunged into the fray, immediately engaging the Persian cavalry. He was reportedly in the thickest of the fighting, hacking and parrying, narrowly escaping death on several occasions. At one point, a Persian noble named Spithridates raised his axe to strike Alexander down, only to be cut down himself by Alexander's loyal general, Quietest the Black. It was a close call, a moment where history could have taken a very different turn. Historians still argue whether Alexander's initial charge was a feint to draw out the Persian cavalry, or a genuine, if risky, attempt to break their lines immediately. Regardless, the sheer ferocity of the Macedonian attack, coupled with the disciplined advance of the phalanx once they secured the riverbank, proved too much for the Persians. Their cavalry was shattered, and their Greek mercenaries, left exposed, were systematically annihilated. It was a resounding victory for Alexander, a statement win that reverberated throughout Asia Minor. It opened the gates to his conquest of the region, secured his supply lines, and perhaps most importantly, sent a clear message to Darius III and the rest of the Persian Empire. A new, formidable force had arrived, and he meant business. The Granicus wasn't just a battle. It was Alexander's grand opening act on the Asian stage. After the resounding splash Alexander made at the Granicus River, Asia Minor was essentially his oyster. You'd think, after such a dramatic victory, he might just charge straight for the Persian heartland, wouldn't you? But Alexander, for all his impetuosity, possessed a strategic mind that understood the importance of securing his flanks and consolidating his gains. His goal wasn't just to defeat the Persian army, it was to dismantle their influence piece by piece, and that meant liberating, or perhaps more accurately, incorporating the Greek cities along the Anatolian coast. This was a critical phase of his campaign, spanning from late 334 to early 333 BCE, as he moved methodically down the western and southern coasts of Asia Minor. His approach to these cities varied, often reflecting their individual responses to his arrival. Some, like Ephesus, welcomed him with open arms, eager to throw off the Persian yoke and embrace the perceived freedom of Hellenic rule. In these instances, Alexander would abolish oligarchies, restore democracies, and show a benevolent face, presenting himself as a liberator rather than a conqueror. He'd even offer sacrifices to local deities, a smart move to win over the populace. It's almost funny to imagine the local politicians scrambling to put on a good show for their new liberator, probably dusting off their best togas and practicing their most eloquent speeches. Other cities, however, were less enthusiastic, either due to loyalty to Persia or fear of Macedonian reprisals. Miletus and Halicarnassus, two heavily fortified coastal strongholds, put up a fierce resistance, relying on their strong walls and Persian garrisons. These became major tests of Alexander's siegecraft. The siege of Miletus was relatively swift, but Halicarnassus, defended by a skilled mercenary commander named Memnon of Rhodes, who, interestingly, was a Greek fighting for the Persians, proved to be a much tougher nut to crack. The fighting was brutal and protracted, a grim reminder that conquest was not always glorious cavalry charges. Alexander had to employ his full array of siege engines, from towering siege towers to powerful battering rams, to finally breach the city's formidable defenses. Even then, the Persians and their mercenaries managed to evacuate much of their force by sea, frustrating Alexander's complete victory. Historians still argue whether Alexander's strategy of liberating the coastal cities was primarily about securing naval bases to neutralize the superior Persian fleet, or more about cementing his image as the champion of Greek freedom. Either way, his control of these cities cut off Persian access to the Aegean Sea, significantly weakening their naval power and protecting his supply lines from Macedon. He was systematically dismantling the Persian presence in the region, one city at a time, establishing a solid base of operations before venturing further inland. This was the patient, methodical side of Alexander, ensuring that his rear was secure before the inevitable, much larger clash with the main Persian army, led by King Darius himself, awaited him somewhere in the vast plains of Asia. Have you ever encountered a problem so impossibly tangled that it just seems to defy all conventional solutions? A riddle so perplexing, an obstacle so stubborn, that it calls for something truly unconventional? Well, that's exactly the situation Alexander found himself in when he arrived at the ancient city of Gordium in Phrygia, sometime in 333 BCE, and encountered the legendary Gordian knot. This wasn't a military blockade or a strategic challenge. It was a deeply symbolic and religiously significant puzzle, rooted in prophecy. The story goes that an ancient Phrygian king, Gordius, had tied an ox cart to a pole with an incredibly intricate knot made of cornel bark and so cunningly contrived that no ends were visible. An oracle had long ago declared that whoever could untie this seemingly impossible knot would become the ruler of all Asia. Talk about pressure. For centuries, countless travelers, kings, and adventurers had tried and failed, leaving the knot as a testament to its impenetrable complexity. It had become a symbol of an intractable problem, something utterly unyielding. Alexander, with his destiny-driven mindset, couldn't just walk past it. To ignore it would have been to dismiss a prophecy that seemed tailor-made for someone of his perceived divine favor. It's almost amusing to picture the scene. The great conqueror, fresh from victories, now standing before a piece of rope, probably surrounded by advisors offering their 2 cents, all of them probably scratching their heads. The air must have been thick with anticipation, everyone waiting to see how the man destined to rule Asia would tackle this rather unusual hurdle. Did he meticulously pick at it, trying to find a hidden seam? Did he spend hours poring over its twists and turns? Not Alexander. Legend has it that after studying the knot for a moment, and perhaps sensing the implied challenge to his future rule, he declared, "It makes no difference how they are loosed." Then, with a characteristic flash of decisive action, he drew his sword and with a single, powerful stroke, cut the knot clean in half. Problem solved. Just like that, the prophecy was fulfilled, not by unraveling, but by sheer, brutal force. The onlookers, initially stunned, quickly erupted in cheers, seeing it as yet another sign of Alexander's divine favor and his unique ability to overcome obstacles in his own unconventional way. Historians still argue whether this dramatic cutting of the knot was a literal event, as described by ancient writers like Arrian, or a more metaphorical tale designed to highlight Alexander's decisive character and his ability to transcend traditional methods. Was it a moment of pragmatic genius, or simply a bit of historical flair added later to enhance his legend? Regardless of the precise details, the story of the Gordian knot became a powerful metaphor for Alexander's approach to conquest. when faced with an obstacle, he didn't just try to bypass it or unravel it. He simply removed it, often with audacious and overwhelming force. It solidified his image as a man who didn't play by conventional rules, a man who forged his own path to destiny, literally cutting through complexity to seize his future. All right, picture this. Two of the most powerful men in the ancient world, kings of their respective realms, finally about to lock horns in a direct head-to-head clash. It's the ultimate showdown, the one everyone had been waiting for. That moment arrived in November 333 BCE at the Battle of Issus, a narrow coastal plain situated between the mountains and the sea, in what is now modern-day Turkey. Alexander, having secured Asia Minor and untied the Gordian knot, was moving south through Cilicia. Darius III, the great king of Persia, wasn't sitting idly by. He had assembled a truly massive army, a force of such numerical superiority that it must have stretched for miles. A glittering array of chariots, cavalry, and infantry drawn from across his vast empire. Imagine the sheer logistical nightmare of moving such a force, let alone feeding it. Darius was confident, perhaps overly so, in his numerical advantage, seeing Alexander as little more than a bothersome upstart. His plan was to crush the Macedonians with sheer weight of numbers, to overwhelm them in an open field. But then, a twist. Alexander, moving eastward, somehow managed to pass behind Darius's army, who had marched south through the very same mountain passes. This put Darius in a precarious position, effectively cutting off his supply lines and trapping him against the sea and mountains. It was either a brilliant piece of strategic misdirection by Alexander or a monumental blunder by Darius, and historians still argue whether this was an intentional maneuver by Alexander to choose the battlefield, or if Darius simply miscalculated Alexander's movements entirely. Either way, Darius found himself forced to turn his massive army around and face Alexander on the narrow plains of Issus, a location that inadvertently negated his overwhelming numerical superiority. This was a stroke of incredible luck for Alexander, or perhaps, as he would have seen it, divine intervention. The cramped terrain meant that Darius couldn't deploy his entire force, turning what should have been a rout into a more manageable engagement. Alexander, as always, led the charge, spearheading his companion cavalry on the right flank, smashing through the Persian left wing. His objective wasn't just to win the battle. It was to find and kill or capture Darius himself. The battle quickly devolved into a chaotic, desperate melee. The Macedonian phalanx, using its sarissas, those famously long pikes, created an impenetrable wall of steel, grinding down the Persian infantry in the center. Darius, witnessing the collapse of his flanks and the sheer ferocity of Alexander's personal charge, panicked. His bodyguards were falling around him, and the Macedonian phalanx was closing in. He famously fled the battlefield in his royal chariot, leaving his family, his mother, wife, and daughters behind to be captured by Alexander. This was not just a defeat for Persia. It was a humiliation. Alexander had not only routed the great king's army, but had also captured his immediate family, a prize of immeasurable strategic and symbolic value. Issus was a decisive victory, solidifying Alexander's reputation as an invincible general and revealing Darius's weakness as a leader. The road to the heart of the Persian Empire was now wide open, but Alexander still had some important detours to make before he fully pursued the fleeing king. Imagine the scene. You've just won a monumental battle, sent the king of the world's greatest empire fleeing, and captured his entire royal family. Most conquerors would probably pop open the ancient equivalent of champagne and march straight on to the capital. But Alexander, ever the strategic genius, understood that true conquest wasn't just about winning battles. It was about securing the foundation of your power. That meant neutralizing the formidable Persian navy, which still posed a significant threat to his supply lines and his control of the Aegean. Since he didn't have a strong navy of his own to challenge them head-on, he adopted a brilliant, if utterly brutal, strategy: deny the Persian fleet its ports. This led him to the island city of Tyre, a seemingly impregnable fortress situated on an island half a mile off the Phoenician coast. It was late 333 BCE, and Alexander knew that leaving Tyre unconquered would leave a dangerous hole in his coastal control. Tyre was not just any city. It was an ancient and immensely wealthy Phoenician trading hub, famous for its purple dye, its formidable walls, and its almost unparalleled naval power. Its citizens, confident in their island's natural defenses and their powerful fleet, initially refused Alexander's demands for surrender. They even reportedly killed his envoys and threw their bodies from the walls, which, as you can imagine, wasn't exactly a diplomatic move designed to win friends and influence people. Alexander, enraged by their defiance and the killing of his messengers, famously declared that he would take Tyre, even if he had to build a road to it. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is exactly what he did. For 7 arduous months, from January to July 332 BCE, Alexander embarked on one of the most audacious and challenging engineering feats of the ancient world. He ordered the construction of a massive causeway, or mole, connecting the mainland to the island. Imagine the scale of this project: thousands of soldiers and engineers working tirelessly under constant harassment from Tyrian archers and ships, dumping rocks, rubble, and timber into the sea to create this monumental bridge. It was back-breaking work, a true test of his army's discipline and his own unwavering resolve. The Tyrians, for their part, put up an incredible fight. They harassed the mole builders with projectiles, attacked the causeway with fire ships, and even used divers to sabotage the underwater foundations. It was a war of attrition, a siege unlike any other. Alexander eventually constructed 2 massive siege towers at the end of his causeway, equipped with catapults and archers to suppress the defenders. He also gathered a fleet from his newly acquired coastal cities, Cyprus and the Phoenician mainland, to counter Tyre's navy, an ingenious move to fight a naval war without a traditional navy. Historians still argue whether the scale of the siege was truly necessary, or an expression of Alexander's stubborn refusal to be denied. Regardless, the perseverance paid off. After months of relentless assault, combining naval bombardments, land-based siege engines, and repeated attempts to breach the walls, Alexander's forces finally broke through. The city was taken with immense brutality. Thousands were killed, and tens of thousands enslaved, a stark and terrifying example of Alexander's ruthlessness when faced with prolonged defiance. The fall of Tyre was a psychological victory as much as a strategic one, demonstrating that no city, however well fortified, was beyond Alexander's grasp. It secured his flank, eliminated the Persian naval threat in the Mediterranean, and opened the path to Egypt. After battling through a seemingly impenetrable siege like Tyre, most people would probably want a long, well-deserved nap. But Alexander, he just kept going, turning his sights southward towards one of the most ancient and enigmatic lands on earth, Egypt. This wasn't just another conquest. It was a journey into a civilization utterly unlike any he had encountered. A land steeped in millennia of history, pharaohs, and gods with animal heads, It was late 332 BCE when Alexander, having finally subdued the eastern Mediterranean coast, led his army into Egypt. The surprising thing, though, is that this wasn't a bloody, hard-fought campaign like the one against Tyre. Quite the opposite. The Persian satrap, governor of Egypt, Mazakis, having witnessed Alexander's unstoppable march through Asia Minor and the Levant, and perhaps realizing the futility of resistance, offered little to no opposition. He simply surrendered. Imagine the relief for Alexander's weary troops to march into a land not as invaders to be fought, but as welcomed liberators. This welcome wasn't entirely surprising. For over a century, Egypt had been under Persian rule, a period often characterized by heavy taxation, disrespect for Egyptian traditions, and suppression of their religious practices. The Egyptians, with their rich and ancient heritage, resented their Persian overlords deeply, so when Alexander arrived, he wasn't seen as just another foreign conqueror. He was hailed as a deliverer, a champion sent by the gods to restore their ancient glories. It was a brilliant piece of PR, even if unintentional. Alexander, ever the astute politician and keen observer of local customs, quickly grasped the importance of respecting Egyptian culture and religion. He didn't just march in. He went through the traditional rituals, presenting himself not as a foreign king, but as a legitimate successor to the pharaohs. He famously traveled to the ancient city of Memphis, where he offered sacrifices to the Egyptian gods, particularly Apis, the sacred bull, a deity deeply revered by the Egyptians. He was then formally crowned pharaoh, a powerful symbolic act that legitimized his rule in the eyes of the native population. This was a masterstroke, far more effective than any military might could have been. Historians still argue whether Alexander genuinely believed in his divine legitimacy as a pharaoh, or if it was simply a shrewd political move to gain the loyalty of the Egyptians. Regardless, his respect for their customs ensured that Egypt, unlike many other conquered territories, remained remarkably stable under his rule. He spent several months in Egypt, organizing its administration, appointing a mix of Macedonians and Egyptians to positions of authority, and ensuring its vast grain supplies would support his army. But the highlight of his time in Egypt, a moment that epitomizes his forward-thinking vision, was the founding of a city that would forever bear his name and become a beacon of learning and commerce for centuries. This wasn't just a rest stop. It was a strategic pause, a moment to consolidate, rebuild, and look to the future, preparing for the inevitable final confrontation with Darius, who was surely, by now, trembling in his royal sandals. So Alexander is in Egypt, crowned pharaoh, revered by the locals, and with an army finally able to catch its breath after years of non-stop campaigning. What does a visionary conqueror do with a moment of relative peace? He doesn't just rest, he builds. And that's precisely what Alexander did on the Mediterranean coast of Egypt, establishing a city that wouldn't just be a military outpost, but a shining testament to his ambition and foresight. Alexandria. This wasn't just a whim. It was a strategically brilliant decision and a truly audacious undertaking. Imagine scouting a site, a flat stretch of land between Lake Mareotis and the Mediterranean Sea, near the small fishing village of Rakotis. Alexander reportedly traced out the city's future boundaries himself with barley meal, a symbolic act that must have looked utterly peculiar to the local onlookers. He envisioned it as a hub for trade between the Mediterranean world and the riches of the East, a bridge between two continents, and a naval base from which to control the Eastern Mediterranean. It's almost comical to think about laying out an entire metropolis with grain, But that's Alexander for you. Grand visions, even in the details. The city was designed on a grid plan by the Greek architect Dinocrates of Rhodes, a revolutionary concept for urban planning at the time, featuring wide streets, public buildings, and a magnificent harbor capable of accommodating large fleets. This wasn't just a military encampment. It was designed to be a vibrant, multicultural metropolis. He ordered the construction of a lighthouse, which would later become the legendary Pharos of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, guiding ships into its bustling port. He established schools, libraries, and temples, aiming to make Alexandria the intellectual and cultural capital of the Hellenistic world. This emphasis on culture and knowledge was a direct influence of his former tutor, Aristotle, who had instilled in Alexander a deep appreciation for Greek learning. Historians still argue whether Alexander fully comprehended the long-term impact of founding Alexandria, or if it was merely one more strategic move in his grand campaign. However, the fact remains that Alexandria quickly grew into one of the largest and most influential cities of the ancient world, surpassing even Athens in its intellectual prowess and economic might. It became a melting pot of cultures, attracting scholars, merchants, and artists from across the known world, a true cosmopolitan center that thrived for centuries after Alexander's death. Its famous library, housing an unparalleled collection of scrolls, became the center of ancient scholarship, drawing the brightest minds to its halls. This act of city founding in Egypt wasn't just a physical construction. It was the laying of a cultural cornerstone for the Hellenistic age, an era where Greek language, art, and philosophy would spread across vast swathes of the globe. It was a clear demonstration that Alexander was not just a destructive force, but also a creator, a builder of enduring legacies. With Egypt secured and a new city taking root, Alexander had finally cleared his rear, neutralized the Persian naval threat, and solidified his control over the western fringes of the Persian Empire. The time had come for the ultimate confrontation, the moment of truth that would decide the fate of 2 empires, as Darius, having regrouped and raised an even larger army, was awaiting him further east, after consolidating his gains in Egypt and planting the seeds of a new cultural hub in Alexandria. Alexander finally turned his full attention to the ultimate prize, Darius III, and the complete dismantling of the Persian Empire. This wasn't just another battle. This was the battle, the final decisive confrontation that would determine the fate of 2 colossal powers. It all culminated on October 1st, 331 BCE, on the vast plains of Gaugamela, near modern-day Mosul in Iraq. Darius, learning from his past mistakes at Issus, chose this location specifically because its wide-open expanse would allow him to deploy his immense army, rumored to be well over 250,000 men, to its full advantage. He even reportedly had the ground leveled to ensure his chariots could operate effectively, a curious detail that speaks to his meticulous yet ultimately futile planning. Imagine the sight, a seemingly endless sea of Persian soldiers drawn from every corner of their vast empire, spearmen, archers, cavalry, even scythed chariots, those terrifying machines designed to scythe through enemy ranks. Facing them, Alexander's much smaller, but highly disciplined Macedonian force, probably around 47,000 strong. The numerical disparity was staggering, almost comically so, making it seem like an impossible challenge for Alexander. Historians still argue whether Darius's army truly numbered as many as ancient sources claimed, but there's no doubt it was significantly larger than Alexander's. Despite the overwhelming odds, Alexander was not intimidated. He understood the psychological impact of such a massive force, but he also recognized its weaknesses. Unwieldy command structures, diverse contingents with differing loyalties, and a king prone to panic. His strategy at Gaugamela was a masterpiece of tactical brilliance, relying on deception, disciplined maneuvering, and the unparalleled shock charge of his companion cavalry. He famously positioned his forces in an oblique order, stretching his flanks to prevent being outflanked by the vast Persian numbers. As the battle began, he feigned a retreat on his left flank, drawing the Persian cavalry wider and wider, creating a crucial gap in their center. Then, in a move that defines his military genius, Alexander led his elite companion cavalry in a wedge formation, charging directly for the heart of the Persian line, aiming straight for Darius himself. It was a daring, almost suicidal move, a lightning strike through the chaos. The fighting was ferocious. Darius's scythed chariots, initially terrifying, proved largely ineffective against the disciplined Macedonian phalanx, whose soldiers simply opened their ranks to let them pass through, then closed in. As Alexander's charge bit deep into the Persian center, Darius, seeing his personal guard crumbling and the Macedonian king bearing down on him, once again lost his nerve. He turned his chariot and fled the battlefield, abandoning his army to its fate. His flight triggered a general rout of the Persian forces. Gaugamela was a cataclysmic defeat for Persia and an absolute triumph for Alexander. It wasn't just a victory, it was the effective end of the Achaemenid Empire. Darius would live for a little longer, a king without a kingdom. But his power was broken. Alexander was now, unequivocally, the king of Asia, and the path to the fabled Persian capitals lay wide open before him. So after the dust settled on the plains of Gaugamela, with Darius III in full flight and his massive empire shattered, what do you think Alexander's first thought was? Probably not a quiet evening of philosophy. No. His eyes were firmly fixed on the prize, the glittering legendary heart of the Achaemenid Empire, its magnificent capitals. This was no longer just about defeating an army. It was about symbolically dismantling an entire civilization, taking possession of its wealth, and claiming its legacy. First up was Babylon, the ancient city of wonders, with its hanging gardens and towering ziggurats. To Alexander's surprise, and probably immense relief, Babylon offered no resistance. Its satrap, Macedonia, who had fought bravely at Gaugamela, wisely decided to surrender the city peacefully in October 331 BCE, knowing that defiance would only lead to destruction. Alexander, always keen to present himself as a legitimate ruler, entered Babylon not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. He showed great respect for Babylonian traditions and religion, restoring temples, particularly that of the god Marduk, and making sacrifices according to local rites. He appointed a Persian as satrap, alongside a Macedonian military governor, a clever move to ensure stability and demonstrate his willingness to integrate existing structures. It was a remarkably peaceful transition, a stark contrast to the brutality shown at Tyre. Next, he marched on to Susa, another of Persia's royal cities, in December 331 BCE. Susa too surrendered without a fight, and Alexander acquired an immense treasure, gold and silver beyond the wildest dreams of any Macedonian, enough to fund his armies for years to come. He also captured Darius's family, who had been taken there after their flight from Issus, and treated them with respect, a move that further enhanced his reputation for magnanimity. But the real jewel in the Persian crown, the symbolic heart of their power, was Persepolis. This was the ceremonial capital, the city built by Darius the Great and Xerxes the Firm, adorned with magnificent palaces, grand staircases, and intricate carvings that proclaim the might and glory of the Achaemenid Empire. It was here that the great kings celebrated Nowruz, the Persian New Year, and stored their most sacred treasures. Alexander's approach to Persepolis in January 330 BCE was different. Unlike Babylon and Susa, there was a brief, desperate resistance from local tribes attempting to protect the royal road, which Alexander swiftly crushed. Upon entering the city, Alexander allowed his troops to plunder it, a brutal reward for years of campaigning. But then came the most famous and controversial act, the burning of the royal palace of Persepolis. Historians still argue whether this act was a calculated political statement, a deliberate act of revenge for the Persian burning of Athens during the Greco-Persian Wars, or simply an act of drunken revelry and impulsive destruction, as suggested by some accounts involving the Athenian courtesan Thais. Regardless of the precise motivation, the imagery of the flames engulfing the magnificent palace, a symbol of Persian power, was incredibly potent. It signaled the definitive end of the Achaemenid Empire and Alexander's ultimate triumph. It was a destructive act, yes, but one that paved the way for a new era, with Alexander firmly established as the unchallenged ruler of a vast new domain. The fall of Persepolis marked the culmination of his initial goals and the beginning of a whole new set of challenges. Ruling and integrating an empire of unprecedented scale, you'd think, wouldn't you, that after conquering the heart of the world's largest empire, destroying its capitals, and effectively ending a dynasty that had ruled for centuries, a man might consider taking a well-deserved sabbatical. Perhaps a nice long cruise on the Mediterranean, or maybe just settling down to enjoy the immense spoils of victory. But Alexander, as we've consistently seen, was not just any man, and his ambition knew no conventional bounds. With Darius III now a fugitive king and the Persian heartland under his control, Alexander's gaze turned eastward towards the vast, unknown, and incredibly challenging territories of Central Asia, often referred to by the Greeks as Bactria and Sogdiana. This wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about total conquest, about reaching the very edges of the known world. His pursuit of Darius was relentless, driven by a desire to personally capture or kill the last Achaemenid king and prevent any resurgence of Persian resistance. For over a year, from 330 to 329 BC, Alexander led his forces through incredibly harsh terrain, across deserts and over towering mountains, facing not organized armies in pitched battles, but elusive guerrilla fighters, fortified mountain strongholds, and fiercely independent local tribes. This was a completely different kind of warfare. A grinding, brutal campaign against an enemy that used the unforgiving landscape to its advantage. It was during this relentless pursuit that Alexander finally caught up with Darius, only to find him already dead, murdered by his own satrap, Bessus, who then proclaimed himself the new king. Alexander reportedly found Darius's body, and in a surprising act of respect, covered it with his own cloak and ordered a royal burial. Historians still argue whether Alexander's mourning for Darius was genuine or a shrewd political move to present himself as the legitimate successor rather than a mere usurper. Regardless, the death of Darius removed the last vestige of the Achaemenid Empire and forced Alexander to deal with a new, self-proclaimed Persian king. Bessus, however, was quickly captured and executed in a gruesome manner, a stark message to anyone else contemplating rebellion. The campaigns in Central Asia were defined by grueling marches, brutal sieges and Alexander's relentless personal involvement, often leading the most dangerous assaults himself. He conquered fortified cities like Syropolis and Marakanda, modern-day Samarkand, and faced fierce resistance from figures like Spitamenes, a Sogdian chieftain who proved to be a master of guerrilla warfare, inflicting significant losses on Alexander's forces. It was in this region that Alexander also encountered Roxane, the daughter of a local Bactrian noble, whom he would marry. This strategic marriage, designed to secure his rule and integrate the local aristocracy, was a clear indication that Alexander was no longer just a conqueror. He was attempting to become a legitimate ruler of these diverse peoples. The campaigns in Central Asia pushed Alexander and his army to their absolute limits, exposing them to extreme weather, unfamiliar fighting styles, and the psychological toll of fighting an enemy that seemed to emerge from every rock and crevice. It was a brutal, protracted struggle, but Alexander, ever determined, eventually subdued the region, extending his empire to previously unimaginable eastern frontiers. But even as he consolidated control, a new, even more mythical land beckoned him further east, a land rumored to be at the very edge of the world. You know, it's one thing to hear tales of mythical lands from afar, whispers of gold and strange beasts at the world's end. It's another entirely to pack up your army, march for years, and then actually decide to plunge into those uncharted territories. But for Alexander, after consolidating his grip on Central Asia, the lure of the unknown was simply irresistible. His ambition had become a force of nature, pulling him ever eastward towards the fabled land of India. This wasn't a strategic necessity, nor was it about avenging past wrongs. It was pure, unadulterated curiosity and an insatiable desire to reach the ends of the earth and the great outer ocean, as his tutor Aristotle had often spoken of. He truly believed he was destined to reach the very edge of the world, as known to the Greeks. So, in 327 BCE, after meticulously planning and gathering supplies, Alexander led his army across the formidable Hindu Kush mountains, a grueling trek through treacherous passes, often battling fierce mountain tribes along the way. Imagine the sheer logistical nightmare. Thousands of men, horses, elephants. Yes, he acquired some along the way. And supplies, navigating altitudes that would make a modern mountaineer gasp. It's almost comical to think of how utterly unprepared they must have been for the sheer scale of the Indian subcontinent, a land far more vast and populous than anything they had encountered. Upon descending into the fertile plains of the Punjab region, Alexander found a land divided into numerous independent kingdoms and tribes, rather than a unified empire like Persia. This meant a series of smaller, yet often fiercely contested engagements. Some rulers, like Taxiles of Taxila, wisely chose to submit to Alexander, recognizing the futility of resistance and perhaps hoping to gain an advantage over their rivals. These alliances provided Alexander with crucial local knowledge and resources. However, others were determined to fight for their independence. Alexander's campaigns in India were marked by a mix of pitched battles, brutal sieges against fortified cities, and constant skirmishes against resilient local populations. His army, though seasoned and disciplined, was facing new challenges: unfamiliar terrain, monsoon rains, and an enemy that employed war elephants, terrifying living tanks that were unlike anything the Macedonians had ever encountered. The very idea of an elephant stampede must have been enough to make even the bravest Macedonian soldier gulp. Historians still argue whether Alexander truly understood the vastness of India and the endless resistance he might face. or if he was simply driven by an almost childlike wonder and the sheer momentum of his conquests. One thing is certain, his march into India was a testament to his relentless drive, his unyielding determination to push beyond perceived limits, and his desire to leave no corner of the known world unconquered. This journey would lead him to his most challenging and ultimately his final major battle against a formidable Indian king who would prove to be a worthy adversary. So Alexander is deep in India, his army having endured treacherous mountains and skirmishes with local tribes. But he's about to face his most formidable challenge yet on the subcontinent. This wasn't just another petty chieftain. This was King Porus, the ruler of the Pauravas, a powerful kingdom situated between the Jhelum and Chenab rivers. Porus was no pushover. He was a colossal figure, literally, a warrior king of immense stature, and he commanded a considerable army, famously including a corps of around 200 war elephants. Imagine the psychological impact of seeing those living, thundering tanks arrayed against you for the first time. It's enough to make even the most hardened veteran reconsider his career choices. The stage was set for the Battle of the Hydaspes River in May 326 BCE, one of Alexander's hardest-fought engagements. The Hydaspes, modern-day Jhelum, was swollen by monsoon rains, making a direct crossing impossible under the watchful eye of Porus's army. Alexander, ever the master of deception and tactical brilliance, knew he couldn't simply charge across. For weeks, he engaged in a clever war of feints and maneuvers. He repeatedly marched his troops up and down the river, making loud demonstrations of preparing to cross at various points, forcing Porus to constantly shift his forces to counter these perceived threats. Meanwhile, under the cover of darkness and a fierce storm, Alexander secretly moved a significant portion of his army, including his elite cavalry, several miles upstream to a hidden crossing point. It was a risky gamble, relying on the storm to mask their movements and the element of surprise to catch Porus off guard. Historians still argue whether Porus genuinely fell for Alexander's feints, or if he simply lacked the resources to effectively counter Alexander's superior mobility and tactical cunning. Regardless, Alexander's deception worked. When Porus finally realized the main Macedonian force was crossing elsewhere, he had to divide his army, sending a small contingent to meet the crossing force while keeping the bulk of his elephants and infantry to defend against a potential frontal assault. This division proved fatal. As Alexander's forces landed on the far bank, they quickly engaged Porus's smaller detachment. Then came the main event. Alexander launched his signature cavalry charge, aiming to encircle Porus's formidable war elephants and infantry. The battle was chaotic and brutal. The elephants, initially terrifying, caused immense casualties, but also proved difficult to control, sometimes trampling their own side. The Macedonians, despite being rattled by the elephants, adapted quickly, targeting their mahouts and hamstringing the beasts. Alexander's disciplined phalanx, with their long sarissas, managed to hold their ground, creating lanes for the cavalry to exploit. Despite being wounded and having his horse Bucephalus die, though not in the battle itself, but likely from age and exhaustion shortly after, Alexander personally led his men throughout the ferocious fighting. Porus, on his elephant, fought with incredible bravery and valor, a truly majestic warrior until the very end. He sustained multiple wounds but refused to surrender. When finally captured, Alexander, impressed by his courage, famously asked Porus how he wished to be treated. Porus replied, "Treat me, O Alexander, as a king." Alexander, true to his word, not only restored Porus to his kingdom, but even expanded his territories, making him a loyal ally. The Battle of the Hydaspes was a Pyrrhic victory for Alexander, a testament to his military genius and his army's resilience. But it came at a heavy cost. The brutal fighting, the unfamiliar terrain, and the sheer ferocity of the Indian resistance had taken a severe toll on his weary troops, pushing them to their breaking point and ultimately setting the stage for the most significant challenge to Alexander's authority from within his own ranks. So, Alexander had just fought one of his toughest battles at the Hydaspes, emerging victorious, but with an army battered and weary, pushing the limits of human endurance. You'd think, after facing down war elephants and a king as formidable as Porus, they'd be eager for a victory parade and a long, well-deserved rest. But Alexander, ever the insatiable conqueror, had other ideas. His eyes were still fixed eastward, on the vast, rich Gangetic plains, on the mighty Nanda Empire, a land rumored to be even wealthier and more powerful than anything they had yet encountered. His plan was clear: conquer the Nanda Empire, reach the mythical Great Outer Ocean at the very edge of the world, and then, perhaps, finally turn back. But his army, by this point, had been marching, fighting, and enduring for 8 grueling years, crossing thousands of miles, facing every imaginable hardship, from searing deserts to freezing mountains and relentless monsoons. They had been away from home, their families, and everything familiar for far too long. They had faced down the mighty Persian Empire, traversed Central Asia, and battled through India. They were exhausted, homesick, and quite frankly, terrified of what lay further east. Whispers of even larger armies and more terrifying beasts, elephants numbering in the thousands, filtered through the ranks. This growing discontent reached its boiling point in 326 BCE at the Hyphasis River, modern-day Bes. Alexander, full of his usual fire and zeal, called a council of his senior officers, laying out his plans for the next stage of the invasion. He spoke of glory, of wealth, of reaching the very edge of the world, of surpassing the deeds of Dionysus and Heracles. He probably used all his most convincing rhetoric, the kind that had swayed them through countless battles. But this time it fell on deaf ears. His most trusted general, Conus, speaking on behalf of the weary troops, finally broke the silence, delivering a powerful and emotional plea. He reminded Alexander of their suffering, their dwindling numbers, their longing for home, and the sheer impossibility of conquering an endless land. It was an unprecedented act of defiance, a direct challenge to Alexander's authority from within his own inner circle. Imagine the tension in that tent. The great king being told no for the first time by the very men who had followed him through hell and high water. Historians still argue whether this mutiny was a spontaneous outburst of collective exhaustion or a carefully orchestrated intervention by Alexander's leading generals, who saw the folly of further eastern expansion. Regardless, Alexander was furious. He reportedly retreated to his tent for 3 days, sulking in anger, refusing to speak to anyone, hoping to break their resolve. But the army remained firm. They would go no further. Faced with the unwavering refusal of his loyal veterans, the conqueror of the world finally had to concede. It was a moment of profound significance, a rare instance where Alexander's indomitable will was met and defeated, not by an enemy army, but by the sheer human limits of his own men. He performed a ritual sacrifice, and when the omens were unfavorable, or perhaps when he conveniently interpreted them as such, he announced the decision to turn back. It was a bitter pill to swallow for a man who believed in his divine destiny. But even Alexander, the seemingly unstoppable force, understood that an army that refused to march was no army at all. The dream of reaching the ocean to the east was shattered, and the long, arduous journey home began. So the dream of reaching the mythical edge of the world was dashed by the mutiny at the Ephesus, forcing Alexander to turn his gaze westward. But if his march into India was a grueling challenge, his return journey, particularly through the Gedrosian desert, was nothing short of an absolute nightmare, a deliberate act of penance, or perhaps, as some might argue, an ill-conceived display of sheer hubris. This wasn't a retreat. Alexander, ever one to spin a narrative, framed it as an exploratory expedition, charting new territory and securing his southern flanks. Imagine having to choose between two equally horrific options: sailing the uncharted waters of the Indian Ocean, or marching through one of the most desolate and unforgiving deserts on earth. Alexander chose the latter for a significant portion of his army, while dispatching a fleet under the command of Nearchus to explore the coastline and meet him at the Persian Gulf. The desert march, which began in late 325 BCE, was an unmitigated disaster. The Gedrosian desert, parts of modern-day Balochistan and Iran, was a vast, scorching expanse of sand dunes, devoid of water, food, and almost any form of life. The heat was unbearable, the terrain treacherous, and the lack of supplies catastrophic. It was a daily struggle for survival, a grinding attrition against the environment itself. The army suffered horribly. Thousands perished, not from enemy blades, but from thirst, starvation, heat stroke, and exhaustion. Men reportedly went mad from dehydration, and horses, invaluable companions for years, were slaughtered for food or simply collapsed and died. The logistical planning, usually a strong suit for Alexander, completely failed in this unprecedented environment. Wells were often poisoned or dried up, and guides sometimes led them astray, whether intentionally or through incompetence. It's almost comical in its tragic absurdity. The greatest conqueror in history, brought to his knees not by an army, but by a landscape. Historians still argue whether Alexander chose this route as a deliberate act of shared suffering with his men, a way to regain their loyalty after the Ephesus mutiny, or if it was simply a monumental miscalculation of the desert's severity. Some sources suggest he wanted to outdo the mythical journeys of Cyrus the Great and Semiramis, who had reportedly failed to cross this very desert with their armies. Regardless of his motivations, Alexander reportedly endured the same hardships as his men, refusing water when others had none, sharing their suffering, which undoubtedly boosted morale among the dwindling survivors. After weeks of unimaginable torment, the emaciated remnants of Alexander's army finally emerged from the Gedrosian desert, a fraction of the force that had entered it. They were met by Nearchus's fleet, which had its own harrowing tales of the sea to tell. The reunion, though joyful, was a grim testament to the cost of Alexander's relentless ambition. This brutal trek was a stark reminder that even the greatest military genius could not conquer nature itself. It tempered Alexander's image of invincibility, and perhaps gave him a new appreciation for the limits of human endurance, though he likely never fully grasped the depth of suffering his men had endured. The journey home continued, but the scars of Gedrosia would forever mark the memory of Alexander's Indian campaign. After the harrowing ordeal of the Gedrosian desert, the shattered remnants of Alexander's army finally stumbled back into the more civilized parts of his empire. You'd think the Conqueror, having pushed his men to their absolute limits and lost thousands, would now settle down to simply enjoy his vast domain. But Alexander was not one to simply settle. His return from the east, spanning from 325 to 324 BCE, was less about relaxing and more about an intense period of reorganizing his immense empire and reasserting his authority over a vast and diverse realm. He discovered, to his considerable annoyance, that many of the satraps, governors, and military commanders he had appointed in his absence had abused their power, embezzled funds, or ruled independently, assuming he would never return from the ends of the earth. This wasn't just a mild inconvenience. It was a direct challenge to his central authority and the stability of his newly formed empire. Imagine his frustration after years of grueling campaigning to find his own house in disarray. He reacted with characteristic ruthlessness and efficiency, launching a series of purges known as the executions at Susa. Many corrupt officials, both Macedonian and Persian, were summarily executed or dismissed. He disbanded their private armies, confiscated their ill-gotten gains, and appointed new, more loyal administrators. It was a clear, brutal message. Alexander was back, and he would tolerate no insubordination or corruption. This widespread crackdown sent shockwaves through the empire and served to re-establish his iron grip. However, his reforms weren't just punitive. Alexander also embarked on a more ambitious policy of integration, aiming to fuse Macedonian and Persian cultures, a vision often referred to as the fusion policy. He recognized that simply conquering territories wasn't enough. He needed to create a unified empire, a blend of East and West, if it was to endure. This meant promoting mixed marriages, incorporating Persian soldiers into his army, and adopting certain Persian customs himself, much to the dismay of many of his traditionalist Macedonian generals and companions. He began training thousands of Persian youths in Macedonian military techniques, a move that particularly ruffled feathers among his veterans, who saw it as a dilution of their elite status. Historians still argue whether Alexander's fusion policy was a genuine ideological vision for a new Hellenistic world order, or a pragmatic necessity to govern an impossibly vast and diverse empire. Perhaps it was a bit of both. He was attempting something truly revolutionary for his time, building an empire not just on conquest, but on a deliberate cultural synthesis. This period also saw significant financial reforms, including the minting of new coinage and the establishment of a standardized administrative system. Alexander was essentially trying to transform a collection of conquered lands into a cohesive, functioning state, a challenge arguably as great as any battle he had ever fought. But even as he grappled with these administrative complexities, another major event was on the horizon, an event designed to solidify his fusion policy and leave a lasting cultural mark, a series of mass weddings that would shock and intrigue his Macedonian companions. So, Alexander is back from the east, cracking down on corruption and wrestling with the enormous task of governing his sprawling empire. But his vision, remember, wasn't just about control. It was about integration, about weaving together the disparate threads of East and West into a single unified tapestry. And what better way to literally interweave cultures than through marriage? This led to one of the most remarkable and controversial events of his reign, the Susa weddings in the spring of 324 BCE. Imagine the scene. The ancient Persian capital of Susa, now under Macedonian rule, transformed into the setting for a mass marriage ceremony of unprecedented scale and cultural significance. Alexander himself, having already married Roxane, took another Persian wife, Statera, also known as Basin, a daughter of Darius III, and potentially a third, Parysatis, a daughter of Artaxerxes III. These were not just personal choices. They were powerful political statements, signaling his intent to fully integrate himself with the former Persian royal family and legitimize his rule in the eyes of his new subjects. But it didn't stop there. He then orchestrated the marriage of around 80 to 90 of his senior Macedonian officers, including his most trusted generals, to Persian noblewomen. Simultaneously, over 10,000 Macedonian soldiers who had previously taken Asian wives were given lavish gifts and celebrated with traditional ceremonies. It was a grand spectacle, designed to symbolize the union of the two cultures and forge new bonds of loyalty. Historians still argue whether the Susa weddings were a genuine attempt at creating a lasting Greco-Persian elite or a largely symbolic gesture to quell discontent and promote stability among the conquered populace. Was it a heartfelt embrace of multiculturalism or a cynical political maneuver? Regardless, for many of his Macedonian veterans and commanders, it was a bitter pill to swallow. They had spent years fighting the Persians, and now they were expected to marry them. Many viewed it as an insult to their traditions and a betrayal of their loyalty. Their resentment simmered, particularly among the older, more traditional generals who believed Alexander was going native. It's almost comical to imagine the awkward dinner parties that must have followed, with Macedonian generals trying to navigate new customs and communicate with their Persian wives, probably with more than a few cultural misunderstandings. Despite the underlying tensions, Alexander pressed on with his fusion policy. He continued to incorporate Persian soldiers into his phalanx, train Persian youth in Macedonian military techniques, and dress in Persian attire, further alienating some of his most loyal Macedonian companions. The Susa weddings were a bold and visionary step, but they also highlighted the growing rift between Alexander's ambitious, often radical, vision for his empire and the traditionalist views of his Macedonian core. He was building something new, something unprecedented. But not everyone was ready to follow him into this brave new world, and the stresses of this cultural clash would soon manifest in other ways, culminating in a period of great personal sorrow for Alexander. Even the most driven, seemingly invincible figures are still, at their core, human. And for Alexander, amidst all the grand imperial reorganizations and controversial cultural fusions, he was about to face a personal tragedy that would shake him to his core, a loss that would reveal his deep emotional vulnerability. The death of Hephaestion. This wasn't just the loss of a general or a trusted advisor. Hephaestion was Alexander's dearest friend, his companion since childhood, his closest confidant, and arguably the love of his life. Their bond was legendary, often compared to that of Achilles and Patroclus in Homer's Iliad, a story Alexander himself deeply admired. Hephaestion was more than just a general. He was Alexander's second self, sharing his triumphs, enduring his hardships, and offering him counsel and support that no one else could. In the autumn of 324 BCE, while Alexander was in Ecbatana preparing for his next campaign, Hephaestion fell ill. The exact cause of his illness is still debated by historians. Some suggest typhoid fever, others perhaps a violent stomach ailment, exacerbated by excessive drinking. Imagine the frantic efforts to save him, the best physicians of the ancient world probably scrambling to his bedside. But despite all efforts, Hephaestion's condition worsened rapidly, and he died. The news shattered Alexander. His grief was immediate, overwhelming, and utterly profound. He reportedly lay prostrate for days, refusing food and drink, cutting his hair, a traditional sign of mourning, and even ordering the manes and tails of his horses to be shorn, a bizarre yet powerful display of his sorrow. He cancelled all public celebrations, ordered a period of official mourning throughout the empire, and perhaps, most tellingly, executed Hephaestion's physician for failing to save him. A clear sign of his irrational grief and rage. It's almost unsettling to picture the conqueror of the world, usually so composed and strategic, completely undone by personal loss. He ordered a monumental funeral pyre for Hephaestion in Babylon, one of the most extravagant and costly ever conceived, a literal architectural wonder designed to honor his friend. The cost was astronomical, prompting protests from some of his advisors. But Alexander spared no expense, determined to give his beloved companion a send-off befitting a king. He even requested that Hephaestion be deified, granted heroic cult status, which was later approved by the Oracle of Siwa, reflecting the immense influence Hephaestion had on Alexander and his life. Historians still argue whether Alexander's grief was amplified by guilt over his treatment of Hephaestion, or simply a pure expression of immense personal loss. Regardless, Hephaestion's death marked a significant turning point in Alexander's life. He became noticeably more withdrawn, irritable, and perhaps even more tyrannical. Some accounts suggest his judgment suffered, and his behavior became more erratic. The loss of his closest confidant left a void that could never be filled, and it's clear that a part of Alexander died with Hephaestion. The vibrant, ambitious young king who had set out to conquer the world was now a haunted, grieving man, pushing forward with a lingering sorrow that would accompany him to his own final days. The end was, in fact, much closer than anyone could have imagined. So Alexander, the undisputed master of the ancient world, was now a king shadowed by profound grief, having lost his closest companion. You'd imagine he might slow down, perhaps even consider his own mortality more carefully. But Alexander, ever driven by an internal fire that seemed to defy human limits, pushed on. He returned to Babylon in 323 BCE, the magnificent city he intended to make the capital of his sprawling empire, and began making preparations for his next grand venture, a massive campaign to conquer Arabia. He envisioned establishing new trade routes, further expanding his empire, and perhaps, as some historians suggest, finding a new purpose to fill the void left by Hephaestion's death. But fate, as it often does, had other plans for the great conqueror. In late May or early June of 323 BCE, while immersed in planning and holding numerous banquets and feasts, Alexander fell ill. The exact nature of his illness remains one of history's most enduring and fascinating medical mysteries, debated by scholars for centuries. A true whodunit of the ancient world. Was it malaria, a common disease in Mesopotamia? Typhoid fever, perhaps, given the conditions of ancient warfare and sanitation? Or did he succumb to the cumulative effects of years of arduous campaigning, multiple serious wounds, and a notoriously heavy drinking habit? The ancient sources offer conflicting accounts, some describing a sudden, violent fever, others a gradual decline. It's almost comical in its tragic irony. The man who survived countless battles, treacherous deserts, and assassination attempts, brought down by an invisible foe. For 11 agonizing days, Alexander's condition worsened. His fever persisted, he suffered intense pain, and his ability to speak gradually faded. His loyal Macedonian generals, increasingly alarmed, gathered around him, desperate for a sign, for a word. The common soldiers, deeply anxious about their leader, reportedly insisted on being allowed to file past his deathbed, a somber procession of hardened warriors bidding farewell to the man they had followed to the ends of the earth. Alexander, though too weak to speak, reportedly acknowledged them with a silent gesture. Historians still argue whether Alexander was truly poisoned, as some ancient rumors suggested, perhaps by disgruntled generals weary of his continuous campaigns and fusion policies, or even by Aristotle's family, angered by his treatment of Callisthenes. While the poisoning theory makes for a dramatic story, most modern scholars lean towards natural causes, given the lack of definitive evidence and the prevalence of diseases in the ancient world. As his strength ebbed away, his generals reportedly asked him, "To whom do you leave the empire?" Alexander, with his last breath, or perhaps a mere whisper, is said to have replied, "To the strongest," or to Craterus, though the latter is highly disputed. This ambiguous answer, if true, set the stage for decades of bloody conflict among his successors. On June 10th or 11th, 323 BCE, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar II in Babylon, Alexander the Great, at the age of just 32, breathed his last. The sudden, unexpected death of the conqueror of the world plunged his vast empire into immediate chaos and uncertainty. The man who had forged an empire of unprecedented scale, driven by an ambition that knew no bounds, was gone, leaving behind a legacy that would echo through millennia, but also a power vacuum that would consume his life's work in a brutal struggle for succession. So Alexander the Great, the man who had reshaped the world in little over a decade, lay dead in Babylon, just 32 years old. You'd think an empire forged by such a singular will would simply continue, but the abruptness of his passing created a monumental power vacuum, and his enigmatic last words, "To the strongest," or a similarly vague pronouncement, became a tragic prophecy. What followed his death was not a smooth transition, but decades of brutal, internecine warfare among his generals, known as the Wars of the Diadochi, or successors. Imagine the scene just hours after his death. A gathering of his most powerful generals, the men who had shared every triumph and tribulation with him, now staring at each other with a mixture of grief, ambition, and suspicion. There was no designated heir. His half-brother, Philip III Aridaeus, was mentally incapacitated, and his pregnant wife, Roxane, would later give birth to a son, Alexander IV, but he was a mere infant. Neither offered the strong leadership needed to hold such a vast and diverse empire together. Immediately, the empire began to fracture. Generals like Perdiccas, who initially attempted to maintain unity as regent, quickly found themselves vying for control with ambitious rivals such as Ptolemy in Egypt, Seleucus in Babylon and the East, Antigonus in Asia Minor, and Lysimachus in Thrace. It was like a game of ancient musical chairs, but with armies and entire kingdoms as the stakes. Each successor, seeing himself as the rightful heir to Alexander's legacy, began carving out their own spheres of influence, leading to a relentless series of battles, assassinations, and shifting alliances. The dream of a unified Greco-Persian empire, which Alexander had so passionately pursued with his fusion policy and grand weddings, quickly evaporated. Macedonian traditions reasserted themselves, and many of Alexander's Persian appointees were purged or replaced. The vast wealth he had accumulated was used to fund endless wars, and the cultural synthesis he envisioned was largely abandoned, replaced by more pragmatic, Hellenistic monarchies. Historians still argue whether Alexander himself had a long-term plan for his empire's succession and governance, or if his insatiable drive for conquest simply meant he never fully considered it. Was his death the ultimate failure of his grand vision, or merely an inevitable consequence of a system built entirely around his personal genius? Regardless, by the time the dust finally settled, nearly half a century later, Alexander's empire had been irrevocably fragmented into several independent Hellenistic kingdoms. The most prominent were the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, founded by Ptolemy I Soter, the Seleucid Empire in the Near East and Asia, founded by Seleucus I Nicator, and the Antigonid kingdom in Macedon and Greece, founded by Antigonus Monophthalmus, and later consolidated by his descendants. These successor kingdoms, while constantly at war with each other, nonetheless continued to spread Greek culture, language, and institutions across vast swathes of the former Persian Empire, fulfilling a part of Alexander's cultural legacy, even if his political unity did not endure. The Hellenistic Age, a period of immense cultural exchange, scientific advancement, and artistic flourishing, was a direct, if unintended, consequence of Alexander's conquests. His name, of course, lived on, becoming a legend almost immediately upon his death. The sheer scale of his achievements, the audacity of his campaigns, and the force of his personality ensured his place in history as one of the greatest military commanders and most influential figures of all time. His legacy wasn't just in the lands he conquered, but in the new world he inadvertently created, a world forever changed by the footsteps of a young king who truly believed he was destined to conquer everything. And so, as the echoes of trumpets fade and the last glint of bronze armor disappears over the horizon of ancient history, we are left with the quietude of a story concluded. The dust of millennia settles over the vast plains and towering mountains where Alexander once strode, a whirlwind of ambition and destiny. His life, a blazing comet across the sky of antiquity, illuminates the eternal human drive for greatness, for pushing beyond the known, for etching one's name into the very fabric of time. Even now, as you close your eyes, you might almost feel the whisper of desert winds, hear the distant murmur of ancient battles, or catch the faint scent of jasmine from a long-lost palace. His story, like all true epics, reminds us that even the most monumental sagas eventually find their quiet ending, fading into the gentle embrace of dreams, leaving only the profound weight of what once was. Rest now. Let the narratives of empires and conquerors drift away like mist, and find peace in the stillness of the night. It's truly fascinating, isn't it, to step back from the whirlwind of battles and conquests, the grand pronouncements and tragic downfalls, and really think about Alexander the Great, not just as a figure in a textbook, but as a person, a driving force of history. You find yourself asking, what sort of man was he really, beyond the legend? Because, let's be honest, the story we've just journeyed through, filled with audacious decisions and unbelievable victories, paints a picture so extraordinary, it almost feels like fiction. And yet, it happened. He was a creature of paradox, wasn't he? A man of profound learning under Aristotle, capable of genuine respect for conquered cultures, yet also capable of astonishing brutality and impulsive rage. He could weep openly for a fallen friend, yet order the razing of a city to send a message. This blend of high culture and ruthless pragmatism is, I think, one of the most compelling aspects of his character. It's almost as if he embodied the very best and very worst of human ambition, all rolled into one charismatic package. One cannot help but marvel at his sheer, unadulterated will. Think about it. The decision to cross the Hellespont, to actively challenge the might of the Persian Empire, was not just audacious. It was, by conventional standards, bordering on insane. Who, in their right mind, would take a relatively small kingdom like Macedon and declare war on the largest empire the world had ever seen? It speaks to a level of self-belief, a conviction in his own destiny that few leaders throughout history have ever possessed. Was it inherited madness from his mother, Olympias, or the calculated ambition instilled by his father, Philip? Historians still argue about the true source of his relentless drive, but whatever its origin, it was the engine that propelled him from Bella to the banks of the Indus, refusing to acknowledge any limit, any boundary, any no. It's almost comical, in a darkly humorous way, to imagine the conversations among his generals, those hardened Macedonian veterans, as Alexander kept pointing further east on the map. Wait, you want to cross those mountains now, and then fight more elephants? Sir, respectfully, are you quite all right? Yet they followed him, almost without exception, which speaks volumes about his charisma and his ability to inspire unwavering loyalty, even in the face of impossible odds. And what about his fusion policy, that ambitious dream of blending East and West? It's tempting to view it through a modern lens, as a benevolent act of multiculturalism. But was it? Or was it, perhaps, a shrewd recognition that to hold such a vast and diverse empire together, he couldn't simply rule by conquest alone? He needed to legitimize his reign in the eyes of his new subjects, to co-opt their elites, and to make them feel part of a larger whole, albeit a Macedonian-led one. The Susa weddings, for instance, are a masterclass in political symbolism. Forcing his generals to marry Persian noblewomen was a bold, almost provocative move, revealing Alexander's willingness to challenge deeply ingrained prejudices and traditions within his own ranks. It also, quite frankly, reveals a certain disregard for the feelings of those around him, a single-minded pursuit of his vision that often came at a personal cost to his companions. Historians still grapple with whether this policy was a genuine ideological commitment to a new world order, or simply a pragmatic strategy for long-term control. I lean towards a bit of both, a pragmatic genius with a genuine fascination for the cultures he encountered. But ultimately, his primary goal was always to secure his legacy and his empire. His flaws, too, are as compelling as his strengths. The increasingly volatile temper, the fits of rage, the excessive drinking, the growing isolation from his old companions, these are all stark reminders that even the greatest conquerors are fallible. The execution of Quietest the Black, his loyal general who saved his life at Granicus during a drunken argument, is a particularly haunting example of his darker side, a moment where the lines between friend and subject blurred dangerously, and the deep, almost irrational grief over Hephaestion's death is a poignant counterpoint to his otherwise iron will. It shows a man who, despite his divine ambitions, was still profoundly human, capable of heart-wrenching sorrow. It makes you wonder how much of his later, perhaps more reckless, decisions were influenced by this immense personal loss. Did it push him further into a fatalistic pursuit of glory, or merely expose a vulnerability he had always kept hidden? Ultimately, Alexander the Great left behind not a unified empire, but a fragmented world, albeit one profoundly shaped by Hellenistic culture. His true legacy lies not just in the lands he conquered, but in the cultural currents he unleashed, the Greek language and ideas that spread across vast swathes of Asia and Africa, and the intellectual and artistic flourishing of the Hellenistic age that followed. He was a whirlwind, a force of nature, and his story continues to captivate because it speaks to the limits of human achievement, the intoxicating allure of power, and the enduring mystery of a man who, in just 32 years, changed the course of history forever. He reminds us that sometimes the most profound impacts come not from long reigns, but from intensely lived, fiercely ambitious lives that burn brightly and briefly, leaving an indelible mark on the world.